The office should have been empty that night, but 3 women stayed behind. Not for the work, not for the deadlines, just for me. And in that quiet, after-hours glow, everything between us began to change. The office always feels different once the sun has gone down. The fluorescent buzz fades to a softer hum, and the light spilling from computer screens and desk lamps paints the room in a quieter mood than the daylight ever allows. By then, most of my coworkers have already gone home, carrying their briefcases, their laughter, their chatter down the elevator. But tonight, I found myself still at my desk, the last straggler, tapping away at reports that weren't really urgent but gave me a reason to stay. There's a certain peace in an empty office. The silence wraps around you, the way a blanket does on a cold night. But this evening, I wasn't alone. 3 women from my department were still there. Each of them could have left hours ago, yet they lingered. I remember the first moment I noticed it. I looked up from my monitor to stretch, and I realized their desks were still lit. One sat leaning back in her chair, glasses low on her nose as she scrolled through an email with a faint frown. Another was at the kitchenette, pouring tea into a small ceramic cup she'd brought from home, the steam rising like a signal in the dim air. The third was tidying papers on her desk, humming softly to herself, so quietly I almost wondered if I'd imagined it. For a moment, I hesitated to ask why they were still here. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe they had real work to finish. Still, something in the way they carried themselves made me think otherwise. Their pace was unhurried, almost deliberately slow, as though none of them were in any rush to leave me behind in this quiet office. The woman with the glasses looked over at me first. Her lips curved into a small smile, one that felt both knowing and casual. "You're still here," she said, her voice low but warm. I laughed softly, rubbing the back of my neck. "Trying to convince myself I'm being productive." Her smile widened, and she nodded as if she understood something I hadn't said aloud. The scent of the tea drifted toward me next. Chamomile, maybe, gentle and floral, mixing with the faint trace of coffee grounds still lingering in the breakroom trash. The woman who had brewed it cradled the cup between her palms like it was something precious. She caught me watching, and instead of turning away, she tilted her head and offered me a quiet smile too. The third woman finally spoke, her voice carrying across the desks with a soft teasing edge. "Looks like we're all terrible at going home on time." That made the 4 of us laugh, and the sound was different than it had been during office hours. Softer. Closer. Almost like the laughter you hear in a living room among friends rather than coworkers scattered across a workplace. And in that moment, with their presence filling the room around me, I felt something shift. This wasn't just about deadlines or unfinished tasks. It was about the 4 of us being here together, in a space that suddenly felt more like ours than the company's. The longer I sat there, the more I realized the silence in the office wasn't really silent at all. It carried a kind of presence, gentle, expectant. The occasional tap of a keyboard, the faint clink of porcelain as a spoon stirred tea, the rustle of papers being shuffled, little sounds that somehow felt amplified in the stillness. They weren't noises that broke the quiet, they became part of it, weaving us together in an invisible thread. I found myself glancing up more often than I should have. At first, I thought maybe I was intruding by noticing them, but each time my eyes wandered, I caught something waiting for me. A soft smile, a fleeting look, the subtle shift of a chair angled slightly more in my direction. One of them, the woman with the tea, moved across the office. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, each step deliberate but unhurried. She carried herself with that kind of grace that doesn't ask for attention but inevitably claims it. She passed behind my chair, and for the briefest moment, her sleeve brushed the back of my shoulder. The fabric was light, but the awareness of her nearness lingered long after she walked away. I pretended to focus on the document glowing on my screen, but my heart had already betrayed me, thudding harder than it should over something so small. Across the room, another shifted in her seat, uncrossing and recrossing her legs, the sound of fabric brushing in the stillness. She leaned back and tilted her head toward me, her expression relaxed, almost playful, as if silently asking why I looked so determined to drown myself in work when there was something far more interesting happening right in front of me. And then there was the third. She didn't move much, but her eyes said everything. She glanced at me from behind her glasses, lingering just long enough that it didn't feel accidental. Her gaze held a weight, a quiet acknowledgement, as though she knew exactly what I was thinking but wasn't going to make it easy for me to say it. The room felt smaller somehow. The desks that usually stretched like barriers between us were no longer walls, but bridges drawing us closer. I noticed how their chairs had angled ever so slightly toward me, forming a half circle without anyone ever suggesting it. And I was in the center of it, unspoken, undeniable. I told myself it was nothing. That I was just reading too much into the way they moved, the way they stayed. But then, one of them laughed at something I muttered under my breath, too quietly for anyone to have heard, unless she'd been listening carefully. That laugh wasn't office loud, meant for a group. It was low, warm, and just for me. And in that moment, I stopped wondering if I was imagining things. Their presence, their quiet nearness, it was deliberate. None of them were in a rush to leave. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted this night to ever end. It started the way most after-hours conversations do, with something ordinary. A comment about the printer jamming, about the endless stack of reports waiting in the morning. But soon, the edges of office talk began to blur. Their voices softened, slowed. The rhythm wasn't about deadlines anymore, it was about connection. I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes rest from the screen, and one of them, still holding her teacup, asked me what I really wanted to do with my life. Not my job, not my next promotion, but what I truly wanted. Her tone wasn't casual. It was steady, thoughtful, as though she genuinely cared about the answer. I felt my throat tighten a little before I responded, because no one in the office ever asked me things like that. I admitted I didn't know for sure, that I had ideas, maybe dreams, but they felt half-formed and fragile. She nodded slowly, as if she understood. "It's okay not to know," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the desks. "Sometimes not knowing is the most honest place you can be." That struck me. And it loosened something inside me. The second woman chimed in then, leaning her elbow on the edge of my desk, her chin resting lightly against her hand. "When I was your age," she said with a soft laugh, "I thought I had everything figured out. Turns out, life doesn't always ask for our permission before it changes us." Her smile was wistful, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. For a moment, she didn't look like the confident professional I'd always seen her as. She looked like someone who had lived through storms and carried the echoes of them still. The third woman spoke from her chair, her glasses catching the soft desk light. "I used to think success was about titles. But now, I think it's about moments. The ones you don't see coming." She glanced at me when she said it, holding my gaze just a heartbeat longer than necessary. I swallowed hard. The air felt heavier somehow, but not uncomfortable. It was the weight of honesty, of three women slowly lowering their walls in front of me. And then came the smaller details, their gestures, their nearness. The one at my desk let her fingers trail lightly across the edge of my notebook as she spoke, as if grounding her thoughts through touch. The woman with the tea sat closer now, her knees nearly brushing mine whenever she shifted. And the one with glasses leaned forward slightly, her hand resting on the back of my chair in a gesture so casual it felt deliberate. I listened, but more than that I felt. The sound of their voices, the warmth of their closeness, the way laughter escaped more freely now, softer, more personal. It wasn't the echoing laughter of an office during the day. It was something private, belonging only to this late hour and to us. For the first time, I wasn't just their coworker. In the hush of that room, I was something more, someone they wanted to be seen by, someone they wanted to linger with. And though no one had said it outright, I knew it. The conversation had shifted into a territory we weren't supposed to cross. And yet, none of us wanted to turn back. It happened so subtly, I almost convinced myself it wasn't happening at all. We had been talking for so long that the office clock had faded into irrelevance. The air felt softer, heavier, as if time itself had agreed to slow down just for us. And then, in the middle of reaching across the desk for a stray document, her fingers brushed against mine. It should have been nothing, a simple accident, the kind of thing that happens every day in a busy office. But this wasn't the bustling chaos of a workday. This was late evening, the world outside already asleep, and her touch lingered just a breath longer than it needed to. Warm. Steady. Enough to send a pulse of heat running up my arm. I froze, caught between the impulse to pull away and the undeniable draw to stay in that contact. My eyes lifted, and hers were already on me. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The corner of her lips curved in the faintest smile, a silent acknowledgement that what had just passed between us wasn't an accident. Before I could gather my thoughts, another moment arrived. The woman with glasses leaned over to glance at my screen, pointing at something she pretended to notice in the document. Her hand rested lightly on the back of my chair, fingers brushing the fabric near my shoulder. The pressure was feather-light, but her presence was unmistakable. I could feel the warmth of her palm even through the thin barrier of my shirt. I told myself to focus on the words on the screen, but they blurred. All I could register was her closeness, the subtle scent of her perfume, the quiet steadiness of her breathing beside me. Then, as if choreographed without a word spoken, the third woman leaned forward from her chair across the small circle we had formed. Her knee grazed mine under the desk, just barely. She didn't move it away. Neither did I. The contact was so slight it could have been explained away, but my heartbeat quickened all the same, thudding in my chest like it knew the truth better than I did. For a moment, I wondered if I was losing myself in wishful thinking. 3 touches, so gentle, so fleeting, yet they carried weight. They felt deliberate. And with each one, the silence between us grew louder, more charged. I tried to speak, to keep the conversation alive, but my words came out slower now, my voice lower. They noticed. I could see it in their eyes, soft, searching, quietly daring me not to look away. And in that small cocoon of dim light and hushed laughter, I realized something had shifted. We weren't just co-workers sharing the same room anymore. Every brush of skin, every nearness, every lingering second was rewriting the boundaries I thought existed between us. Part of me wanted to step back, to remind myself of where we were, who we were supposed to be. But another part, the louder, braver part, couldn't ignore the truth. These touches weren't accidents. They were invitations. And I knew then, with a certainty that left me breathless, that none of us were pretending anymore. It surprised me how quickly the laughter gave way to something else. Not silence exactly, but a softer tone, as though we had all agreed, without saying it, to stop hiding behind light jokes and safe topics. The kind of shift that happens when people grow tired of masks. The woman nearest to me, the one who had brushed my hand earlier, was the first to break the new ground. Her fingers rested gently on my forearm as I leaned back in my chair, and her touch wasn't playful this time. It was grounding. She looked at me with an honesty that caught me off guard. "I don't talk about this much," she said, her voice quiet, "but sometimes I feel like I've missed something. That I've built so much around my work, my responsibilities, that I've let the parts of me that wanted love slip away." Her words hung in the air, heavier than any spreadsheet or deadline. I felt her thumb shift lightly, almost unconsciously, as if she was afraid of saying too much but needed to hold on to something solid. In that moment, I realized she had chosen me as her anchor. The second woman spoke next, the one with glasses who had been leaning over my chair earlier. She removed them slowly, as though taking them off might help her reveal something of herself. "I thought I had love figured out once," she admitted, staring down at the frames in her hands. "Marriage, a house, the whole picture. But it didn't last. I don't regret it, not entirely, but sometimes." She paused, her voice catching just slightly. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone will ever look at me the way I once dreamed they would." Her words weren't said with bitterness. They carried something softer, something almost fragile. And when her eyes lifted to meet mine, I felt the weight of that longing she had buried under professionalism for so long. The third woman, the one who had kept her presence steady and calm throughout, finally spoke as well. "I tell myself I'm strong," she said with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Independent. Unshaken. But when I go home at night, the silence." She trailed off, then exhaled as though the words had been pressing against her chest for years. "The silence feels louder than it should." The vulnerability in her confession cut through me. For a second, none of us spoke. The office, once filled with the whir of machines and the chatter of daytime, had narrowed down to nothing but our breathing and the quiet hum of what had just been shared. I wanted to respond, to tell them they weren't alone, that I saw them more clearly in this moment than I ever had before. But before I found the words, they found me. The woman beside me brushed an invisible speck from my shirt, her fingertips grazing my chest with a tenderness that felt far more like comfort than correction. The one with glasses reached out, covering my hand with hers, her palm warm against my skin. And the third, the steady one, leaned just slightly closer, enough for her shoulder to press lightly against mine. In that quiet cluster of touches, I realized it wasn't just about them sharing their pain. It was about trust. They trusted me enough to let the cracks show. And in return, they gave me something I hadn't expected to find in a late-night office. A place where honesty, even when raw, felt safe. At some point, without any of us saying it, the desks no longer felt like the right place to be. The workstations, with their piles of papers and glowing screens, were too sharp, too professional, too much of the world we had just stepped away from. It was one of them, maybe by instinct, who suggested we move to the small break area in the corner of the office. A couch, a low table, a couple of chairs pushed close together. It wasn't meant for anything more than quick lunches or coffee breaks, but tonight it became something else entirely. I sat first, and then, instead of scattering around the space, they chose to sit with me. Not across, not beside in polite gaps of distance, but close. Shoulder to shoulder. Their nearness was deliberate, each of them settling into that small space as though they belonged there, as though I belonged between them. The first brush was subtle, the warmth of a knee against mine. Then another, from the other side. Their touches weren't accidents now, they didn't shift away. My arms were pinned in the gentlest way, framed by theirs, and though I could have moved, I didn't want to. The woman to my right leaned back, her head finding its way onto my shoulder with a sigh so soft it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way I felt it, the delicate weight of her resting against me, the faint tickle of her hair brushing my jaw. On my left, another had taken my hand. Not boldly, not even with words, just a quiet motion under the dim glow of the lamp. Her fingers slipped against mine, tracing first, then entwining. The warmth of her palm against my own center rushed through me, not of excitement, but of something deeper, the unspoken trust of someone choosing closeness. And the third, seated just slightly forward, reached across and let her fingertips draw idle patterns across the back of my other hand resting on my knee. Circles, soft and absent-minded, but each one carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I sat there, surrounded by them, my heart pounding harder than it ever had in any meeting, any presentation, any moment I'd ever thought mattered. I should have spoken, should have asked what this meant, where it was going, what boundaries we were crossing. But none of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence itself was the answer. In their eyes, when I looked at them, I saw it clearly, the decision had already been made. Not with words, not with a plan, but with every quiet action that had led us here. They weren't leaving, and neither was I. The office around us faded into irrelevance. The stacks of files, the ticking of the clock, the city beyond the windows, all of it dimmed compared to the warmth of their bodies pressed into mine. I realized then that this wasn't about chance anymore. It was choice. And in that closeness, in the unspoken decision to stay together in this fragile, delicate moment, I felt the boundaries of what I thought I knew dissolve into something entirely new. For a long time, none of us moved. The couch was small, but the space between us had disappeared, and suddenly it felt like the most natural thing in the world to be pressed so closely together. I could feel the warmth of their bodies, the rhythm of their breathing, even the faint rise and fall of their chests against mine. It was a closeness that felt fragile, like glass, yet also strong enough to carry the weight of everything unspoken. One of them shifted first. The woman leaning her head against my shoulder let out a soft laugh, almost embarrassed by how natural the gesture felt. The sound was low, tender, the kind of laugh people give when they realize they've stepped past a line but don't regret it. She didn't move away, though. If anything, she nestled a little closer, her cheek brushing against the fabric of my shirt as though she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. On my left, the one holding my hand gave it a gentle squeeze. No words, just pressure, deliberate and steady. I turned slightly toward her, and she met my eyes. There was no hesitation there, only the kind of calm you see in someone who has made peace with their choice. Her thumb traced over the back of my hand, slow and thoughtful, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." The third woman, who had been tracing shapes on my knee, leaned forward, her hair falling over one shoulder. For a second, I thought she might pull away, retreat into the safety of distance. But instead she let her head rest lightly against my other shoulder, completing the circle we had unknowingly formed. It was strange, how right it felt. Not dramatic, not rushed, just warm, steady, and real. My arms moved almost on their own, wrapping around them carefully, as though I was afraid of breaking the spell. One arm curled around the shoulders of the woman leaning into me, the other rested across the back of the couch, my fingertips brushing against the hair of the one on my left. And they let me hold them. All three of them, close. The office, so sterile, so practical by day, felt transformed. The desk lamps cast a soft, golden glow, painting us in light that belonged not to work, but to something far more personal. Outside, the city lights blinked faintly through the windows, but in here, the world had narrowed down to this couch, this embrace, this knot of closeness we had tied together without ever saying a word. I realized then that what we were sharing wasn't about breaking rules or chasing forbidden excitement. It wasn't about impropriety or chance. It was about recognition. About being seen, not as roles or titles or colleagues, but as people who had longed for connection and finally allowed themselves to reach for it. So we stayed like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, letting the silence speak louder than words ever could. And as the minutes slipped by, I knew one thing with a certainty I couldn't ignore: this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The kind you don't plan, but the kind you hold on to when it finally finds you.